Awesome. So happy Thursday, everyone, and happy, what's the third session of today, day four of the Internationalization and Athletic Summit. I'm Tim Bryson, founder and CEO of Walk with TAB, and very excited to host another session. I'm in a session that I'm sure I'm going to learn a lot from as I have my pen and paper ready, focused on sport immigration. Last year, we had this individual's colleague come talk about sport immigration from their lens. I'm excited that Chloe is joining us in 2024. Talk about some things that are similar, but definitely a lot that has changed and is changing over the last 365, and what we can expect over the next really, I don't know, year, 2, 3, 4, 5 years as well. So without further ado, Chloe, welcome to the summit, my friend. And if you don't mind, just take the next, I don't know, 3 to 5 minutes. Tell us more about who you are, what you do before we jump into this engaging conversation.
All right. Well, thank you so much, and thank you for having me. It's a subject I love, it's always great to meet other people who are really passionate about sports diplomacy and
Mhm.
sports. I know we said immigration, but I think really sports movement, right,
Mhm.
around the globe, because that's how it ties into that globalization. So quickly about me, I grew up in New Orleans, Louisiana. I was with the Department of State for 16 years. I sort of odd, always wanted to go into immigration law, so became a lawyer to do that. With the Department of State, I was an attorney sort of assisting consular officers, and that was decisions about passports and visas. So who gets them, who doesn't, and how to make that work. So I left last year to join Travis Murphy. And so we were providing services through Jetter Law, focused on immigration and mobility for sports in the sports and entertainment sector, sportsutainment, if you will, because sports is definitely entertaining. So that's my backstory.
So I want you to, if you don't mind, share more about really how you got interested in immigration law. Because I know that story that we talked about before was one that I still remember, and one that is pretty unique, especially as those who are pursuing careers from a very early age.
Yeah, so it was I was very young and had an experience with some refugees and going in to get registered for school. And I'm sure you don't remember this when you were little. Have to take your birth certificate. Your parents have to say, it's mandatory education in the United States. Here's my kid. They're this age. They're here for kindergarten. And going in with some refugees, and they had no birth documents because they had fled their home country and they had nothing. And talking to them later, they don't have family photos from before they arrived in the United States. They left everything behind. And so that was a very powerful experience for me that America could be this draw, that people could be interested in America and
Hmm.
feel that passionately about it. And in part, there's certainly times, maybe over the last few years, especially when, the idea and the dream of America is less clear to some of us Americans, right? With all of the problems. And so, sort of interacting with a community that still sees the United States so powerfully, in many ways helps restore my faith in America, right? Like if we continue to project, an image and a dream that other people want to be part of, maybe we can get back to that as a country.
Let's pray and hope, my friend Chloe. Let's pray and hope. Sport can be a tool for sure. Sport can definitely be a tool, and I appreciate the correction. Sport movement, one I'll definitely be using as well. And so, can you just speak more about what that means in relation to what you do now at Jetter Global Sports and Entertainment, and maybe even some examples? As I mentioned one on Instagram about the Soul Series, but examples of what that looks like in your day to day or week to week.
Yeah, yeah. So, in talking about that global mobility, it really is part of the larger sports diplomacy world. And so that diplomacy can come from at the national level, like from individual countries. The US is a little bit behind on that, not having our own sort of ministry for sport or a sports ambassador. We sort of have some programs, but it more often comes at the league or even sometimes the team level, right? So you see that more and more with teams looking at how can we build up our foreign fan base, and that tends to come both. They're looking at a cycle, right? You can't just take a team over to play in Germany and say like now Germans love football. You know,
Hmm.
if it were that simple, the world would be full of football fans. So it's a whole process. The NFL recently announced another development academy in Australia, and so it's a combination of playing those games overseas, but also building the talent pipeline, right? So, if you're Major League Baseball and you bring in some top talent from Japan, you're going to be looking at building up their fan base in the United States, as well as taking someone who's already popular in Japan and planning to play some games there next year. And what that looks like practically and how we work with that has to do with not just getting visas and getting everyone set up to come into the United States, but what do they need to be in the other country, right? Every country's rules are different when it comes to immigration. Some countries are like, sure, just fly on in here, it's going to be great to see you.
Mhm.
And others are like, nope, they're going to need this kind of visa. And then if you're media, you're going to need this kind of visa. And then if you're a coach, you're going to need this kind of visa. And we need all of that paperwork 6 months ahead. And we're going to need individual applications. And don't forget that the staple has to be perfectly in the right hand corner. Right. And so, when you see these events go off, right, like the WNBA was just playing in Edmonton, when you see the Soul Series, all of that, there is so much that goes into that I think, again, if a league has organized that, they're not staffed by immigration attorneys. They're staffed by people who want to grow the game. And that's where we're able to complement that by saying, okay, great. Here's how we're going to help you do that. We're going to pull off this dream. We're going to support that vision. We're going to take lessons learned from other leagues and other teams that have tried this. We're going to help you make this a success.
That's good. So obviously paperwork's included in, well, for some, not all, but included for most, countries in the visa process, which can be very black and white in regards to what needs to be submitted and what doesn't need to be submitted. But Jetter Global Sports and Entertainment is different. I noticed from talking to you and Travis. And so what makes y'all different than, I'm not gonna say competitors, but other folks who are working in the sport, migration, global mobility industry as well?
Yeah, I think you just hit on it that there is a paperwork piece, but there is so much more when you sort of lift your vision to that
Mhm.
bigger sports diplomacy aspect, right? And so
Mhm.
sometimes that has the component of government affairs, that, for example, the NFL is planning to play the game in Brazil. Brazil recently planned to adopt visa requirements for US citizens that would be incompatible with thousands of people traveling to watch a football game in Brazil. And so they were able to postpone that, right?
Mm.
That it really would have cut in, honestly, to the money that they were going to make. But they need to understand that about the event. And there can be a lot of coordination. At what level, right?
Yeah.
Every government functions differently. So in the US, we have a federal system, we have a state system. Who's going to control the immigration? Who's got the say? And so, that's really an important piece of coordination, because I'm sure there are plenty of firms that can do the paperwork for the visas, but it's understanding, well, nobody can do paperwork for 20,000 fans, right? That's not feasible. Do
Mm.
they want to have a successful event or not? And I think where you see some of that like come to a head is looking ahead to the World Cup, right? And the government is very busy, and it's hard for them to think 2 years ahead, right? To be like, well, in
Yeah.
2 years, they're fighting two wars.
Yeah.
We have
Yeah.
an election coming up. They have a lot on their plate, and so I think, it's not just talking to FIFA about paperwork. It's also saying, where are these fans coming from? Are they
Mm.
countries that need visas? Are they countries that don't need visas? How is that going to work? And with the events spread across Mexico, the US, and Canada, what's that going to look like from a customs perspective, right? And we all know one angry social media post about the wait times at Kansas City Airport, it could tank an event, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
That goes viral. And so I think just having, in some ways, almost translating, right, that governments often think they're speaking the same language
Mhm.
as people, like, say, a league, right, or an entity like FIFA. Like, hey, we want to have a successful event, and the government's like, great, we also want to have a successful event. And you can't all hold hands and be like, wonderful, we'll see you in 2 years.
Mhm. Mhm.
They sort of both miss the point.
I'm laughing because when you said Kansas City Airport, I have an iconic memory in my head in regards to what that airport looks like.
All
Oh
right,
man,
all
that's
right,
yeah,
share, share.
that's why
See,
I'm. Oh,
see what you're saying is you're not going to the World Cup games in Kansas City.
I will not be there. I'm gonna try to go to Mexico. I forget the name of that stadium with the mountain in the background. It's in
Mhm.
I believe Monterey, but Kansas City Airport. Now I'm cool. Like the
Okay.
gate touches the TSA. It's yeah, very small. But let me ask you this question because we do have large, well, mega events. I mean, the mega events coming to the States over the next several years. Both you and Dr. All on Monday mentioned that there's no sport diplomacy strategy at the U.S. level, federal level. There's no international education strategy at the U.S. level, federal level. So how are y'all, from a sport diplomacy standpoint in particular, how do y'all choose to operate, right? Like how are y'all setting the vision? How are y'all forecasting? Trying to get ahead of which I think hopefully we will have a strategy, hopefully sooner than later, maybe not. But how are y'all getting ahead and setting this for yourselves rather than looking to the government for support or direction?
Yeah, I think it's leveraging a number of programs and possibilities across government. And the US is uniquely complicated in that there really are three agencies and sometimes more that touch immigration, right? If you're trying to go to Canada, there's really only one Canadian agency you're going to talk to, the Canadian Border Protection Service. And for some reason, everyone they've ever hired is very good looking. In the US, you're going to be dealing with if you need to file a petition, like for a work visa, you're going to deal with one agency, United States Citizenship and Immigration Services. To apply for a visa, you're going to be dealing with an officer from the Department of State. And then when you actually want to come into the United States, you're going to deal with Customs and Border Protection,
Jeez.
CBP. And so that's a lot, right? And you might be thinking, well, don't they coordinate really well? Anyway, so one of the things we're able to do is talk about Customs and Border Protection does, have some systems where you can talk to them ahead and say like, hey, you're going to have these charter flights. Major soccer teams are coming in. How can we make this easier for you? How can we make it easier for them? Because again, we don't want the social media post about how they hate your airport and they
Hmm.
think you're horrible and unfeeling. We want
Hmm.
everyone to leave this with a positive interaction. We don't want your guys to be stressed out. We don't want them, to be at the end of shifts like, I don't need this. Why isn't everything ready? Right. And so we can help coordinate a lot of that and talk about, okay, well, what works best on both sides? What
Hmm.
makes everybody happy? Because one thing that is amazing about sports diplomacy is you can have win-win, right? Everyone can go home happy, which doesn't happen in most aspects of sport,
Point.
right?
Good point.
Um, you can have that to say, listen, we're going to navigate, we're going to work with the government, we're going to work with these entities. There's always some flexibility there, right? And particularly if you are able to plan ahead. We know this is where you need to be, we know this is when you need to be there,
Hmm.
and you know who needs to be there. Right. And so, maybe we're not going to quibble about an equipment manager, but these are the top players. This is where they need to be. This is when they need to be there. And millions of dollars are riding on them arriving happily when they need to. Right. And just really again translating that, I think, with the government and then helping them understand that impact. Particularly for a situation like FIFA, where soccer is not America's favorite sport. Maybe one day it's up there. It's up there.
Coming. That's coming.
Right.
Yeah.
And I think, coming off this World Cup, maybe it will be, right? We'll see. But it's still a sport that needs to be translated to a certain extent.
Hmm.
Do you know what these events are worth? They know what an NFL game is worth, right? And it's really again making those connections and
Hmm.
working not so much sort of without government, but with government to translate what they need to take some action and then working with the leagues and the teams to help provide that.
Good stuff. And so I'm gonna ask a question. I mean, I hope you know the answer. If you do, it's not a legal question, but the NWSL, right? I think the NWSL is a model that many people should look at because they're growing exponentially right now. And I think other leagues, both men's and women's sports leagues, should take note. But one thing they mentioned was that they expanded their rosters, international roster spots from 5 to 7, I think a couple months ago. So is that something that they would consult?
Congratulations.
Yeah. So is that something that they would come to y'all about or go with? to someone about to say like, yo, how, if we do this, like, what are the implications on visa mobility? I guess provide some context there if you're able to.
Yeah, of course. So, how many international roster spots they can have is down to sort of soccer governing bodies
Hmm.
and US soccer and some other things. But as far as how they use them is really a mobility issue that's been, I would say, more at the forefront in MLS.
Hmm.
And it's just starting to become that issue with the NWSL. And then we'll see, with the USL, and then of course their new Super
Wow.
League has some restrictions, right? Only
Hmm.
it's very common. Even the Premier League has these kinds of restrictions, and
Yep.
you want to keep a league domestic to a certain extent, right? Hopefully fans are passionate enough that even if it's completely a field of non-Americans, you'd still root for them. But
Hmm.
an American league, you want to have some American character.
Sure.
And and so those international roster spots are very valuable if you are a team trying to attract top talent, period. Whether that's
Mhm.
American or foreign, you always want to have an available roster spot for the best player coming along that you can get. And so, if you have someone who's an international player, you want to take and move them to a domestic spot, right? You have more of those domestic spots. So move your international players to domestic. The way you do that is through
Hmm.
immigration. And so, they will have certain time pressures, right? Like they're certain, each league has certain deadlines. Like at such and such a point, that's the snapshot. These are your international, these are your roster, they're domestic rosters.
Dang.
And they'll list them like if you spend a lot of time on the internet looking at US soccer team rosters, you will see the designations, right?
Yep. Yep.
Like international, domestic. So they do have to formally designate that. So, that is a really critical piece and it goes straight to their bottom line, right? If they're trying to calculate who they can acquire in trades, who they can pull out at the draft, they have to know, do they have that spot available? So it's sort of, it goes into their salary cap, which I
Hmm.
cannot speak to. I just know it's insanely complicated.
Yeah.
And people who tell you they're experts in salary cap are experts. So
Mhm. Yeah.
that I can't talk about. But, it's a really critical piece for
Mm.
everyone coaching in operations trying to think about, as their roster is developing and where they want to be. So we don't see that, that I would say the NFL and the NBA yet. There are other leagues that might head in that direction as they internationalize, but you do see it, as you said, really in soccer, being such an international game.
That is a great point. See, that's why I love this. I learn a lot talking to y'all. So we're gonna stay in the US for right now and switch leagues and go to the WNBA. And a point of conversation that we found, well, because it was discovered last week was when Nika Mule couldn't travel to Canada to play in that game. And I had people like, why? Y'all need to talk about this in the summit. Da, 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 da. We're gonna talk about it. So we have Chloe here. And so Chloe, can you just explain what happened, why it happened, why they decided to keep her in the US? Just give some context here.
I will. Although I have to say, I have to sidebar real quick. Tim, you probably get those emails like I do. Like the minute there's a headline about a
Yeah.
player,
Yeah.
like last year there was a player and he's like, I'm separate football player. I'm separated from my Filipino wife. I think 18 people sent that to me within an hour. And I was like, no, no, no. I heard about it. Thank you. Yeah. So Mika, this I could probably spend an hour talking about this, but it'd be really boring to most people. U.S. immigration law is basically 60 years out of date. And that is the sort of the basic structure of immigration was last touched 60 years ago. And there were some significant updates a couple times over the years, but that framework has never really changed. And so, politically, there's a lot of back and forth. Like, should we have skills based immigration, like maybe Canada and some other countries do? Should we remain family based? All of these things. And no one has changed anything. And so there are these visa classifications from A to V currently, the whole alphabet. And the part of the problem being from the 1960s is the classifications that were created then remain the classifications, even if they don't fit modern life. So one example would be gamers. There's a visa specifically for athletes and players. And so if you're an athlete in a major league, you can get that visa. But there have been developments of these other things, and so it was huge several years ago to lean into that esports, because otherwise what visa would gamers get, right? It's a
Exactly.
billion-dollar industry. There are these teams, you want to be bringing them in and out of the United States for competitions, to play for US teams, all of that, which you can't do unless they can get a visa. And you can't, there's no, well, we'll just make a new visa, right? So no, it has to be an existing legal classification. So
Mhm.
esports, then you can call them athletes, and we'll put them in that category. And so Mia's issue is, I think everyone's aware she was a student in the United States who graduated. So if you have a valid student visa, you can continue to travel as a student as long as you're a student, right?
Mhm.
If you were to begin playing professionally as an athlete, you would need to get the athlete visa before you could have that travel. You couldn't come back in and say, I would like to use, there's no sort of general visa. You couldn't just say, I would like to use my general visa. You would need to have a visa that actually matched what you were going to be doing in the United States. Again, the law just has these boxes and you have
Mhm.
to fit into one of them. So if you're a student who, is in training camp or playing a preseason game, it is that awkward box, right? She wasn't going back to school, she wasn't finishing courses, any of those things. So, she had to wait until she does get that player visa.
But while she's on a student visa, she can still compete in the United States.
Yeah, well, here's the other piece. Remember, I talked about a lot of different agencies are involved.
Oh, true.
So sometimes individuals, USCIS, the first agency, they can give you a different status in the United States, but that may not be sufficient. You have to get a visa from someone from the Department of State to actually come back into the country. So there can be a lot of rules regarding what you can do while you're in the US. Sometimes you have to leave and come back in. Sometimes you can stay in and do what you want to do. But if you leave, you have to get the visa before you can come back. So you can see why immigration lawyers stay employed. It,
Yo,
and that's if you want the hot take on Mika, it's wow, immigration's complicated. Just didn't work out for that game.
legit, because this just came to mind. Because if when an athlete is drafted or whatever picked up, their visa status don't change overnight. Once they get their card or their jersey. So is there an expedited process? Is there a separate process? I guess what happens behind the scenes after an athlete gets drafted and goes from a student to a pro athlete?
Yeah, I think the amazing thing is it's on the team or it's on the athlete, right, to take care of. There's no
Mm,
button you can push. When David Stern comes out and is like, great, and so and so has been drafted. No button was activated, right? When Adam
hmm.
Silver stepped up, he's like, hey, this is what's happening. And with the first pick, he's not like, boop, a button is pushed, everything's good.
Yeah.
there there has to be the paperwork with one agency. There may or may not need to then be a visa with the Department of State, and then there can be issues coming back into the United States with Customs and Border Protection. And the rules can vary depending on nationality. Some, for example, Canadians sit in a pretty prime spot. They often don't need visas for certain things, and in other situations they might. Some passport holders get multiple entry visas. So once they get a visa, they might have 5 years to travel before they need another one. And other times they might not. They might get a single entry visa. They might have a visa only for 1 year. So again, it's complicated, and it keeps us immigration attorneys employed.
Yeah, I mean, I'm asking these questions because I really want the answer to them. And also, as you're talking, there's just more questions that keep coming to mind. And so, another example, if you don't mind, we talked through this, right? American sport leagues, some leagues have teams in Canada. So, if a non-US athlete is drafted into, let's say, the NHL, um, what is the US, US American Sport League, where they play for the Toronto Maple Leafs. Are they going through two processes? Like, how does that work?
They might. They certainly might. And so that does come up very frequently. It depends sometimes on the nature of the play. But in the standard case, a hockey player who's playing, let's say they're Russian, playing for the Maple
Hmm.
Leafs,
Hmm.
they would need Canadian immigration paperwork. They would need a US visa to come in and out to play their games while they're here.
Uh,
And if, certain nationalities, again, might have limited visas, Trying to think of a good example. MLB, right?
Hmm.
If you are a Venezuelan player who is playing for the Blue Jays, you might have a very limited, you can get a visa to come to the United States, but it's going to be very limited because
Mm.
of there's something called visa reciprocity. It has to do with how long you can get a visa for, depending on your passport. And so those individuals then often are the ones who most want to get green cards in the United
Hmm.
States, permanent resident, so they can get out from under those visa headaches.
Visa headache. Interesting. So hypothetically, theoretically speaking, if an athlete from a country that does not have friendly, if you will, visa, whatever, they could then potentially change their status to another country before being drafted, before coming to the States.
They might want to do that, or as soon as they're drafted, pursue a green card.
So a green
Lawful
card.
permanent status. Yeah, green card holders, lawful permanent residents, are able to travel in and out of the United States as residents. So that makes that very attractive, and just for a lot of people, a U.S. passport remains extremely attractive.
Wow.
And they might be thinking about their families, right? If they get their green
Mm,
card, families might be able to. If they get U.S. citizenship, the same. And we all know for many players, when they make it, there are a lot of family members and friends who have helped them and they want to do something for. And a lot of times there's an immigration component to that.
as well. This is good. So I'm gonna come out of the United States for a minute and go to Africa, particularly Nigeria. Because we see, I know we talked about this before. I told you I was going to ask you again, but a lot of sport leagues are beginning to operate, do talent identification in Africa. But prior to hitting record on this call, we were talking about Nigeria. So could you share with me some of the things that you're learning, particularly about that country and global movement pertaining to Nigerian
Yeah.
athletes?
You may be aware there are some basketball players, the NBA, of Nigerian background,
Hmm.
plenty more at the college level. And the NFL runs this international pathways program that identifies international talent with the strong potentials in the United States. Number of Nigerian players have come through that program as well. MLS has lots of Nigerian players. Obviously, it's a very large country with its own strong passions for sport, and so you have a lot of really top players across a number of sports that are coming out of there. Um, and one issue, there was a report last week about the issues Nigerian athletes have in getting visas just for the competitions that they want to appear in the rest of the world. And so I think unless it's a household name, a lot of people aren't familiar with those issues, right? Like, well, this is someone who could be a contender, in the marathon, or, in high hurdles or something like that, and they miss out on qualifying races in the UK, in Germany, in the United States, because of delays in getting visas, with visa denials, and it really can be detrimental to the relationships that in bilateral relationships when that starts to happen to a country, right?
Mm,
Because they're saying, hey, our athletes aren't getting these opportunities. We are missing out on these things. And again, you're never going to see a team, well, not never, but it's very unlikely that you'd see a team that qualified, for the Olympics not make it to Paris. But it tends to be individual athletes, and at that lower, more developmental level, where people are missing out, and aren't getting those opportunities. And it really just depends on so much of that global diplomacy, right,
hmm.
piece on sports and educating embassies and consular sections. Do you know what this means for these teams? This is legit. This piece of paper they have that's an invitation to try out for this MLB team is real,
Mm,
right? Um, and in so many ways, that piece of sports diplomacy has lagged behind the rest of the world. Like, we've all heard the amazing stories where someone gets discovered on YouTube,
hmm.
right? The player who is posting just absurd, doing all the combine things, and somebody sees him on YouTube and is like, is this real? Is that how fast they run the 40? Is that what they can bench? And they're going to make a movie about them one day, right? That's how that was their trajectory to the United States and to Major League Sports. But often those stumbling blocks are the visa, because it's still not precisely common to have someone come in and be like, well, I was discovered on YouTube and now the Falcons want to see me. And you're like, what? You
Mm,
know, and to make those connections there, there's just that piece of, I think, general education that's missing. And maybe it's partly that it's not necessarily the youngest people who are making the decisions about who travels, right? Younger people feel confident. They know that's how the world works, and that's something people my generation are still learning, right? Like, oh, this is that TikTok thing is real. You're telling me,
yo.
and I think that's again, it's an aspect of diplomacy, right? In so many ways, diplomacy is first about education. Being open to learning about those stories and then sharing those stories and having that bond over those stories. And using the word stories almost makes it seem like trivial, but it's not. I mean, core memories are really stories, right? That we tell ourselves about something that happened and their impact on our lives. And so the ability to share that is really what diplomacy is all about, and to then have a shared story, right?
Mm,
To understand, well, the success, this team being able to travel to the US is the start of a potential story that is going to be super heartwarming and make a great movie. And I think it's just making sure that people can see themselves in that story.
mm. I like that. Sh- Share stories. Core memories are really stories. That's good stuff, Chloe. I appreciate that. All
Well,
right, I wrote it
sometimes
down.
like, what is it?
No,
A
I
lot
wrote
of the things you remember aren't even accurate, right? Like you just you remember them based on like your impressions and all these other external factors. And so it was like, we're not saying your memories aren't true, but they're a little bit
yeah.
of a story you told yourself. And I was like, but that's a nice way to think about it.
You haven't heard that one. And you also said high hurdles, which I have not heard in a very long time. So I appreciate you
I told you
saying
I'm
that.
old. I'm old, Tim.
But I know what you meant. I know exactly what you meant. So one thing we're talking about tomorrow is sports travel and thinking about like the Paris games, which Wemby's playing in next year, which I'm like obviously very strategic. The Abu Dhabi games, etc. And so y'all get ahead of that and help in working with the French government, the UAE government, and saying, we have the like how soon in advance are those conversations happening?
Um, Honestly, they should take place for anyone who's interested in getting into this space. They should take place as soon as, the event is even a possibility,
Wow.
right? Because there's just a lot of education that needs to take place to make sure there's an understanding and a shared goal. Because you never want to tell a country, well, your immigration requirements are absurd. That's not a path to success, right? It's
Yo.
not a diplomatic way to say that. And you can't go back to a team and be like, your needs are absurd, right?
Yeah.
They're talking about, well, we want to fly at these times. We need to land at these dates. Like, this is about the performance of our athletes, like you can't mess
Hmm.
with that either, right? So again, you're just talking about like you want to translate. You want to find that common story, right? Like this is what success looks like to everybody. Let's make it happen. And so sometimes, again, that's just education. Like, hey, not everybody on the team is an American passport holder, right? Like, what are your
Yep.
feelings on that? Like, what if they do have a Nigerian passport? Are we gonna have problem? Like, how are we? What would make everybody comfortable? And let's do that out. Let's not be scrambling at the last minute. That's a headache nobody wants, right? You don't want to stress out. You're not gonna call a player like the night before the plane leaves for the games and be like, there might be like a little wrinkle with your immigration, right? Like,
Yeah.
oopsie. So you want to do that as far out in advance as possible. And again, just coordinate on both sides. Like what are the potential friction points? How can we take care of those? How can we get them sorted out ahead of time? Because it's really funny. In many ways, success looks like absolutely no headlines, right? Like if you've done your job right, the only
True.
headlines are about the game and what happened. And if there's a negative headline, it's because somebody lost, you know?
Hmm.
If the headlines are about immigration, you have done it wrong.
Wrong. You done it wrong. So going to this question in the chat, is really what are the immigration requirements? How is immigration considered when bidding for mega events? And I guess we could take LA 28. We'll skip over
Yeah.
Paris, but like what's that conversation like?
Yeah. So, I mean, I can't speak to the exact deliberations, but that's one thing I think that actually doesn't come up enough are the immigration requirements. And certainly some countries have more flexibility than others. So, one thing with the last World Cup going into Qatar, they sort of did it. They said, okay, well, we're going to have a new sort of immigration system in place. If you have a ticket to a game, that's your visa. right? If you bought the ticket, you're all confirmed. It wasn't completely across the board, but they really made it incredibly flexible. And
Wow.
their government has the ability to do that, right? I know the astoundment on your face. It's like,
Why?
and
What?
so I mean, I don't know if anyone here is a student of U.S. politics, but like, do you see that happening?
That's not never. Absolutely
Right,
never. Absolutely
right.
never.
And I think so it's one of those things where did FIFA take that into consideration? I think probably the US bidders didn't want it to be taken into consideration. Like no one's going
Mm.
to go into the bidding process like, "Oh, our immigration system is broken and we're not going to change it." Hey, you know, um so I think their ability to consider it as somewhat hampered, right? Like it's not like anyone's like, haha, we don't have our act together,
That's
but give
true.
us give us the World Cup. So they're like, no, 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 we got this. It's gonna be amazing. It's gonna be amazing. Like, look at this mock-up of a stadium. Is that stadium built yet? Sure. Almost like a little bit. We'll break ground in like a week, and and so it just I think maybe that's again where modern realities are not something that have caught up to the people who necessarily consider these bids or even
Mm,
make these bids, right? And I think we touched on this a little bit. I beforehand in my dream world, we can just go back to the world in 2015, or maybe we
mhm,
even go back to the world in like 20 or like 2000, right? Pre 9/11.
mhm,
Um, I mean, it was a lot more paper based, a lot was slower, like so there it's not all upsides, but there were some things that went better, right? And but the world has happened and it's not going back. I need to accept that. And so I think Tamani, you have a really good point. Like, shouldn't this be leading the conversation? Why aren't they thinking about it? And I think it gets back to, again, a lot of people are slower to accept that this is the reality. I think,
mhm,
if you are FIFA and you're coming off what Qatar did, maybe you think like, hey, yeah, countries, when they see the train is on the tracks, they're going to get on board. They're going to figure out a
mhm,
way around the problems. And a lot of places can do that. Maybe the US will do that. I wouldn't hold my breath. And,
mhm,
I think there's also like a lack of, again, understanding if you're making a bid, are you going to be like, well, a lot of it turns on what's going to happen in the 2024 election, and we don't know, and it might be a complete dumpster fire, and I mean, it probably will be, and I hope we all survive. No, they're going to be like, no, these are the processes, it's going to be great. And I
mhm,
think, FIFA isn't led by Americans, so they aren't necessarily being like,
mhm,
well, I guess that 2024 election could really mess with us, right? Instead, they're like, okay, sounds great, sounds great. The US has hosted mega events before,
yeah,
and they can do it again, so it should be great. We last had, let's see, the Salt Lake City Olympics. We're looking forward to LA 28, and so FIFA probably was like, "See, they know how to do it." And you have to be like, "Have you
mm,
been here? Have you been here in the last few years?"
no,
So I think it's not, to your point, that it should be considered. It should be leading the conversation. Countries should be thinking about that when they are bidding, right? Like, what is our plan? What's our plan? And FIFA should be saying, "What is your plan?" I think, and that just hasn't been the case. Even though that's the reality, it hasn't been the case as much as I think it should be.
okay, so I want to stay on that topic a little bit and thinking about sport because, and I was thinking it come to the U.S. again, just because I know it most familiar. But even like national governing bodies, are different national governing bodies either more aggressive, more liberal, more conservative, more reserved in having conversation about sport movement in particular?
Yeah, I think certainly they have been. For a lot of sport governing bodies, based in the United States, they're really focused on U.S. athletes.
Hmm.
So they can be a little bit concerned with more the mobility out to other countries, right? And what the threats are to their US competitors.
True.
So do you want to, raise an, like, for example, in random example, in figure skating, some issues with the Russians. They did have a skater who was disqualified, and then that was arbitration and some decisions about what was happening there. And then, if what would happen to where they placed the Russians in the ranking as a result of that. And then another country challenged that, sort of saying like, but we don't like what happened with that because of where that puts our athletes.
Hmm.
Um, So, you know, I don't think they lean in as much to the US immigration, and it tends to be more of a one off. So,
Got
for
it.
example, they'll have a real top talent who comes in who isn't yet a US citizen, but they really want to compete for Team USA. And that's where they kind of lean in. So, I don't see them taking as much sort of a leadership role on US immigration and more that international movement and international mobility issue, particularly as it relates to sort of protecting the interests of the US athletes.
It's good. Great. Thank you for sharing that. So, all right. So let's begin to close this out. Again, you've been with Jetter, you said a year, just over a year,
Just not quite a year, yeah.
almost a year.
Yeah.
But as you're talking or working in this global space, are you seeing any trends or emerging things related to either sport, country, or anything, gender? I don't know. In your
Yeah,
work so far?
I would say a couple have, and I'll leave the obvious one till second. But I think just the support for that international growth, right?
Mm,
And you know, I'd be hard pressed to say, and it's not my area of expertise, but the NFL has truly tapped out the U.S. market, right? But they, like every other sports league, is like, but we might be missing out on all these other fans, you know, around the world. And you know, sometimes there is a, like with soccer, there's an international network that's going to sort of feed and help build the whole ecosystem around the sport in the United States. And other times, like American football, where it's not that it doesn't have international fans, but it not, you know, we've all been places in the US where you see somebody in a jersey and you're like, hey, you know, it's just not at that level in many other countries yet, but it could be, right? And
true.
there's a lot, you know, I wish they were thinking first and foremost about the diplomacy angle and what could be accomplished, but
That
there's a lot of
part.
money there. There's a
That
lot of money, and you don't want to leave money
also
on the table, right?
also true.
And so, you know, I think it's really that realization. I think the NBA 30 years ago really had the best vision there of our more domestic leagues, and it started to, you know, like not just expanding in Canada, but where else can we go worldwide? And I think other leagues have come to that realization as well. And even just outside of their more traditional markets like baseball, you know, that it's not a hard sell. Baseball in Japan, right? Baseball in Cuba, not a hard sell. Baseball in Venezuela, baseball in Colombia, but where else, you know, can baseball thrive? And you know what's happening in Africa, and you know the just remarkable headlines about, again, going back to the YouTube discovery from Uganda, you know, who's an you know, has his own unique training and is an amazing baseball player. And so I think that that trend will only grow and continue. And I really wish that the
Mm.
US government was a little better at harnessing that. You know, this is America, so not leading and directing that, but
Yo, yeah.
harnessing it, you know, and all of the potential it represents. Of course, the other space, you know, I think that's huge is NIL is the big part of that, but just with that globalization of sport and the diplomacy and mobility that comes with that, that includes at the amateur or arguably amateur levels, right?
Yep. Yep.
Let's put aside whether college athletics truly is amateur, but you know that idea that it's, or at least is a development league, you know, and I think it remains, college athletics is one of the best development leagues in the world
Mhm.
for many major sports, and so that is huge, and I think that's only going to continue to grow. And the NIL piece just relates to that again. Student visa status in the US being so outdated just doesn't match that vision, right? So that trend, you see Zach Edey complaining about it. I think you're going to continue to see that. Some other players, Canadian players particularly, who are able to ink really valuable deals in Canada, and then
Mhm.
every time they're in the US, they gotta, suddenly their social media goes quiet, right? Because they can't be promoting it in the US. That would be work in violation of student status, going back to, you know, the thing with Mika. And, you know, so I think that growth there, and hopefully eventually there'll be enough pressure to actually get, you know, a change sort of in what the US government does to provide these foreign student athletes, if we're allowed to call them student athletes, with
Mhm.
that flexibility that they need. Because I think, again, The practical reality has jumped out far in front of where the government is, and just understanding how many millions of dollars are on the line there, and
Mm.
including for U.S. companies that want to pay these players. Right? It's not like the companies are paying them out of the goodness of their hearts. They are. There's a lot of money that can be made there too, right? Like state. I don't think State Farm hands out checks for free.
Yo.
Like, hey, we just really liked your smile. Um, yeah.
Real quick, so I'm gonna have Leroy on mute to ask his question, and then to want to make sure I understand your question. So, can you mind clarifying a little bit while Leroy, go ahead and ask your question, bro.
Yeah, I am also curious in Tawana's question too. So, Chloe, thank you for coming. This has been a very insightful conversation. And Tim, thank you for hosting this. My question is around the relationship between public opinion and the expansion of sports diplomacy. About a month ago, and Tim knows this, there was a basketball delegation here in San Antonio from Namibia, I believe it was. And I happen to live in San Antonio. But I didn't learn about it until they were gone already. Now, luckily, I'm friends with one of the organizers of it. One of the organizations that organized it was World Learning. I think they're contracted out by the State Department to host sports diplomacy programs. So I just happened to know someone who connected me to the team in Namibia. I had a chance to talk with them. But as a community member, I was quite disappointed that I didn't know about this ahead of time as a way to help promote it and, get other community members aware of it and involved. And so, what have you seen in terms of having local communities here in the US and public opinion being used as a tool to help encourage local politicians and politicians at the federal level to invest more into the expansion of sports diplomacy, both at the local level and federal level?
Yeah.
It's a jam-packed question, so thank you.
Oh, no, thank you. It's an excellent question, and I think go highlights the amazing efforts, sort of why efforts like Tim's are so important in sports diplomacy,
Mhm.
because the State Department does do some work, of course, in the United States, but the biggest one that people are familiar with is getting your U.S. passport.
Yeah.
Mostly the U.S. government in the form of the State Department is going to be overseas,
Mhm.
right?
Mhm.
If you were to stop an average person on the street, not someone with your background, and be like, "What does the State Department do?" They'd be like, "Nothing for me," right? And I think to your point, should that be changed? Yes, sure. But we could go into the litany of issues there, including funding and interest. And I loved working for the State Department. I don't want to take anything off them, but again, there's sort of a vacuum. The State Department has an Office of Sports Diplomacy, but again, a lot of that is focused, like, Travis may have told the story last year where, delivering baseball equipment to these kids who didn't understand baseball, and he's trying to explain in broken
Okay.
Spanish and people learn how to play
Okay.
baseball, and the kids are all happy, and this is amazing, and they're going to have this great experience of America. But there is more of that piece. Okay, great. What if you brought them to the US to a little league game, right? Like how are they going to have that experience? And that is, there's really a vacuum there, right? So, I think to the second part of your question, okay, well, how would you be aware? How could you have these events? How could you do this? And I think there's a lot there that the State Department can do, but again, without a ministry for sport that kind of steps in, it really is on private entities like this. And so one example that's somewhat popular, a lot of cities will have like a sister city.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
And so there is huge opportunities in the private space for groups like this, at the local level, at the state level, to build those relationships. And in some ways, you could say maybe this is the positive, right, of the American system, where it's a free for all and everyone leads in their own direction. That there is a huge opportunity there. That you could work with different federations, sport federations from other countries to say, hey, it would be great to have a visit, and we'd love to have you over, and let's watch an NBA game, but let me explain the G League to you, and let me take you to see the Austin Spurs too, right? That is all done at the individual and personal level. And so there can be some State Department sponsorship for more limited programs, but that coordination across levels of government just not really happening. And again, how to change that, I think it's really on all of us, right?
Gotcha.
Maybe the State Department will one day have billions of dollars and we'll get really good at that. I don't see that happening in the next few years, at least. So luckily, we have folks like Tim who are leading the charge.
Community work, my friend. Great question, Leroy. Tawana, I know you're gonna unmute as well.
Yeah, hi Chloe. Thank you for your time today. So I've heard in your discussion today several times that the United States is probably not going to lead the shift in sports immigration, right? But who outside, what other countries outside the US do you think could be an influential country that could shape sports immigration?
That's a really great question. And I think I don't have experience with all 192 countries. I think there are some they're both positive and negative examples in the field. And I think the negative examples we all know, right? Saudi Arabia sees itself as leading in a certain direction. And they're, the old system, obviously, for many countries, well, actually, maybe every country, getting an Olympic medal is a source of national pride. And the amount of money and resources the country is willing to commit to that varies greatly. I had a really interesting experience once in India, and I was interviewing this young woman. She was maybe 14. She was coming to Colorado Springs, which is a US Olympic Training Center. And she's like, I said, what are you going to be doing? She said, shooting. And she had a slight accent. So I was like, shooting? She's like, shooting. And I was like, but you're 13. I don't understand what's happening. And she was an the Indian women's shooting team. Her specialties were pistol and I think one of the rifle events. And she said, I said, well, how did you get into this? And she said, well, my dad is in the Indian Army and they started a program to increase Olympic medals. And they identified women's shooting as an event that didn't have a lot of global talent. And so they gave special grants to people who had daughters if they trained them in shooting. And so I got trained in shooting, and it turns out I'm good. And so now I'm going to train at the U.S. Olympic Center for the summer to continue to improve. And so I thought that was very fascinating, right? That sort of that leadership can look like that in some countries, right? Like the old Soviet system, like we will have academies. You will not have to have a full-time job. You will do all this. And so I think there's that kind of leadership. Maybe put that in the neutral category. Still didn't quite recover. I was like, you're 13 and you're really good with a pistol? She's like, yeah, I'm really good. Look at my competition scores. I was like, wow, okay. Americans love guns, so hey, you're gonna do great there. And then there's also, I would say, like countries like Australia have shown a lot of leadership in this area, in the more sort of being very deliberate in their sports diplomacy, right? They have a number of very critical sporting institutes that draw talent from around the world. A lot for many athletes in certain sports, it's sort of the last step before the United States, right? You're going to learn English, which remains sort of the international language of sport. You can compete at that high level. And so Australia has certainly been a leader, I would say, in what generally to me seems like a very positive sense, right? Like they're bidding, I can't remember when the Brisbane Olympics are going to be, but in being very calculated in developing those events, wanting to be an international talent center, developing and supporting their sports leagues, again, at the federal level, that we just don't really see in the same way in the United States.
Yeah. Brisbane's 2032.
Okay. There
Just
you
looked it up for you.
go. Thank you.
Let's round this out, my friend. So I gotta ask these last two questions quickly. One, how are you taking care of yourself?
Well, some days I think that's a question I ask myself at the end of the day, and the answer is, I'm not sure. Um, yeah, I would say it's catching sports. That I'm a mom and a busy mom, and so that's a time I can reconnect with my kids, with my husband. Tim, you're not gonna like to hear this, but he went to Michigan. So you're taking the headphones off, really forget and so that getting out and playing together and then watching sports, that's something that for me growing up was a bonding experience and, helps. Americans are so tribal, right? It's our identity. Just the fact that Michigan and Ohio fans hate each other. So,
Mm-hmm.
um, So I think that that's one of the main ways that I do it. It really recharges me, but in a way that lets me also reconnect and sort of be in my other parts of my life that are important to me.
I literally went to a San Diego Wave game last night to do that same thing. I didn't talk to
Awesome.
nobody. I'm like, no one talked to me. I got my beer. Just let me just sit.
And I
So I
always,
feel that deeply. I
yeah.
really do.
And when the whole crowd is like together and all just like there, and I like it because, yeah, sure, sometimes I'm having a beer, but sometimes again, it's like the ability to remind you what's really important, right?
Hmm.
Or take you away from a lot of the daily stressors. And for me, that's the biggest, I think, self-care item is just we can all get bogged down in the daily crap, and it's not important, but unless you have some time to pick your eyes up and think about something else, think about something bigger, the Church of Sport's a good way to do that.
Very true. And then final question, how can I best support you? Both you as a human, you as a VP of like council, you have this fancy title. And then obviously y'all as Jetter. How can I best support what y'all are accomplishing right now?
I think keep doing what you're doing, right? Just to Leroy's great question, there is this space between what the government can and is able to do and what the world demands, right? And so there's that huge space there to build those bridges and amplify what everyone is doing, right? Yeah, I don't mean to slag off the leagues and teams by saying like they're all about the dollars. Um, they appreciate those other aspects too. They got to mind the bottom line, and government is worried about a lot of things, right? So where is that space to again remind people this is what brings us together. This is why we're here. There's an amazing story, and the Caitlin Clark story is compelling on a number of reasons, and I think one of them is of course this is women's sports, but just discovering a new athlete, right? We can all
Mhm.
think about that sport we weren't that interested in until we heard about the athlete or that particular individual. I know people who haven't really watched an F1 race and they heard about Lando Norris winning his first race and they want to know more about that, right?
Mhm.
And it's a great story. And I think again, it's really just being able to amplify that in a really pure and beautiful way that brings everybody together. And so keep on doing it.
I love it, my friend. Well, thank you so much for being here. I'm
Thank you so much for
excited.
having me.
I'm excited. Now I got to talk to Travis one-on-one, talk to you one-on-one. I don't know whoever's next in your company. Or bring y'all both next year. Or just bring you and Travis
We'll do it. We'll
next
do
year.
it.
The
Yeah,
plans
hopefully
to
we
be
can have one of these in person someday soon.
in person next year. A non-US country. So if you have any
I'm
countries in
analog.
particular,
I'm in. Mexico's right there, man. Let's think about it. Let's think
it's
about it.
co it's coming, my friend.
Yeah.
Again, good to see you, Chloe. Everyone else, thank y'all for joining this conversation. We conclude the summit tomorrow with two sessions. One focused on sport travel with Leroy, who's on this call, and then the second focused on NIL, international athletes, because of course we have to talk about it. But day 4 is over. Good to see you, Chloe. Everyone else, have a great evening, and see y'all soon.
Thank you so much
Thank
for having
you.
me.
Thank y'all.
Evening.
Peace
Bye-bye.
out.